You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestel. Welcome to Mysteries and Monsters. Well, it's the final episode of 2020, and what a year it's been. 57 episodes, 63 guests, over 150,000 downloads. We've changed networks, we've grabbed ourselves a new producer, the show's audience has trebled, and overall, it has been a phenomenal year. Every week, I drop a new episode, and I still worry that no one's going to be listening out there. So I want to thank each and every one of you that keep coming back, week in and week out, the people that take the time to email me, or those that share the show on social media and support the show via a Patreon contribution. Thank you, one and all. This year has been strange, to say the very least, so I appreciate your kind words, and here's to a better year for all of us in 2021. Thank you to my brother for his continual artwork, and to Brennan Storr, who's always never too busy to help produce the show. Now, as for today's show, Krissy Eliot rejoins me to discuss some cutting-edge theories in the worlds of botany and science. Krissy has just had a fantastic article published in December's Edge Science magazine entitled Sentient Plants, a Product of Nature or Human Imagination. It's an outstanding piece of writing. I myself and Krissy discuss the possibilities that our understanding towards the world of plants could be akin to that of a fly trying to understand a calculator. Can plants really feel? Are they conscious? Do they actually sleep? Can some people, as they claim, really communicate with plants? And are they planning world domination whilst we sleep? Myself and Krissy cover this and more in a conversation that may make you view your Christmas tree or flowers in your garden in a very different light. Thank you to Krissy for coming back and rejoining me today. As always, you can support the show via our Patreon. Sign up in the show notes for $4 a month for bonus, additional Patreon-only interviews, regular early release of the normal show, and in the new year, a new series covering some strange and intriguing cases that I've not touched upon whilst I've been doing the regular show. You can also find us across all social media platforms. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and please subscribe to our channel on YouTube as we crawl towards 1,000 subscribers and the promised land. Artwork for the show is by Dean Bestel. The show is produced by Brennan Storr from the Ghost Story Guys, and Mysteries and Monsters is a part of the Straight Up Strange network. Okay, so then, time for the final episode of 2020, but I can guarantee you I'll be kicking 2021 off with a stellar guest in the first week of the new year. Now, let's join Krissy to ponder on the potential for sentient plants. The theory of intelligence in plants is something that has been with us for decades within the realms of science fiction and fantasy. From the Ents of Middle-earth to Wyndham's Triffids and the adopted tree stump that becomes a bloodthirsty killer in Little Otik, it has been dismissed as nothing more than conjecture. Yet it seems science is opening up to the possibility that plants may actually be sentient. And to discuss this, it is a wonderfully warm welcome back to Krissy Eliot. Good day, Krissy.
Why, hello there. Thank you for having me.
It's all right, and it's always nice to be able to insert one of my lesser-known favourite horror films in an introduction. So, thank you.
Anything I can do, yeah, to keep the horrors of plants alive. Yeah.
So, you have written this incredible essay in regards to the scientific possibilities in regards to the sentiment of plants and the battle that seems to be going on between certain factions across the world in regards to which camp they sit in, Krissy. So what on earth was it that drew you into this incredibly detailed and confusing subject?
My editor assigned it to me.
Honest as always.
I was really looking to do a really long form piece. This was the longest piece of nonfiction that I've ever written, and it's at, I think, 16,000 words. It's a big one. This is a podcast about mysteries and monsters, and this was a monster of a piece. So it took me probably like 6 months of researching and interviews and all of that in the background to write this. And it's in, Edge Science, which is published by the Society for Scientific Exploration. And it was just, I had always wanted to write for that publication. And so it just sort of happened. Yeah, I was just sort of feeding into the dream of the editor and myself. So we just kind of meshed that together. And then we had this sometimes dreamy, sometimes nightmarish experience of studying spooky plants and intelligent plants.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fascinating topic because it is something that I've often contemplated, and I would be surprised if more people aren't honest enough to say this, Krissy, because I find it very hard to just simply accept that plants exist and that's it. Because I think you can look at hundreds of species from all across the world of plants that show so many adaptations and variations and defense mechanisms and symbiotic relationships with their environments that, if anything, I would be more surprised that there is no probability of what we could class as intelligence than the fact that there isn't.
Right. Yeah. So I guess I should just introduce the whole premise of the piece. Yeah, I should probably get to that just so everybody listening understands that basically the piece is touching on this great debate that's happening in the scientific community about whether or not plants can be intelligent or even conscious. And there is this emerging body of evidence from over the last few decades that has shown that plants actually possess their own versions of like the 5 senses. They can hear, touch, smell. Not obviously not in the same way that we can, but in terms of hearing, they pick up on vibrations and they can sense light, like different kinds of light, blue light, green light, red light, all of these things. And they can actually make choices as to the resources they use and how they use them. So for a really long time, there still is actually this bias against plants, that plants just could not be any sort of valuable beings. To give you a little history, it was in 1509, there was this book, and it was published. It was by this guy. Oh, what's his name? It's like Charles de Beauvais, I think. Very fancy man. But he was this philosopher and mathematician at the time, and he published this book, and it had a hierarchy of beings on the planet, and it went humans, animals, plants, and rocks. So plants were just, considered just barely above a rock in terms of higher thinking and intelligence. And you know how when people write things down, everybody's like, oh, this is official now, or whatever. So like the scientific community was like, oh yes, this is the way. And then it just sort of became this pervasive idea, at least like, I guess maybe the Western world, at least, that plants were kind of duds. They were just resources to be exploited. But now there are these scientists, modern scientists, that are saying this is all bullshit. And I'll stop there, and if you have a question, you can let me know.
Well, I mean, it is very interesting because I think there are 2 clear paths here. There are those scientists that seem to be pushing the boundaries of our current knowledge in regards to the way that plants view themselves in their environment, Krissy, and those that simply revert to the fact that plants are just there for our benefit, whether it's for agricultural means or pollination or sustenance or decoration even. There doesn't seem to be any kind of concept that they offer anything more than that. And yet there are so many studies that, especially that have been done over the last 30 years, that have clearly opened up avenues of investigation that are showing us that plants are far more complex than we could even possibly comprehend 50 years ago.
Right. Yeah. Well, so let me just tell you some crazy stuff that I learned in the process of this piece. So first I'm going to mention this scientist, Monica, I'm going to butcher her last name. I just can't, my Italian it's Gagliano. I cannot pronounce her last name to save my life. Just I'll call her Monica.
Well, she's Monica one of those. G. Yeah, she's one of those wonderful Australians that I would just call a Gagliano. It's
just like, well, that's the thing. I think she's from Italy and then she moved to Australia.
Yeah.
The whole big thing. Anyway, so Monica, old Monty G,
yeah.
she's a revolutionary thinker in the field of botany. So basically, she had this, what's called a dieta. It's something that the Shipibo people of the Amazon lowlands in Peru will do. It's like a practice of communing with a plant, and you ingest the plant, and you can't do anything fun. You can't have sex. You can't eat good food. You can't be distracted by other people, and you basically just focus on the plant being in your body, and then eventually you start to trip. And these are not plants that necessarily would be considered psychedelics. You could do this with a rose. But basically, if you deprive yourself of all of the other distractions of the world, the plant will start to speak to you. So she's this, traditionally trained scientist, and she decides to do one of these dietas, and she does it with a Sakoba. It's like a Balaco Caspi, I think is what the name is. And when she's doing it, she has this dream, and she sees this dark red image with black lines, and she hears the tree tell her all things are connected. And she comes out of this, dream trip experience, and she's like, I have no idea what this means. And then she thinks about it more, and she realizes it was telling her that Sakoba, the tree, can be a blood cleanser. And so she goes back to university, and she's researching the Sakoba tree, and apparently it has all kinds of uses for healing conditions of the blood, and blood vessels, and prevents anemia, inflammation related diseases, things like that. So she had no knowledge of anything about this plant before she did this, and then she ends up learning that she just somehow got all of this knowledge out of nowhere. And so it just completely changed her perspective on plants. And later on, she did more trips with plants, and they ended up telling her things. And they even told her to do some really important experiments. So one of them was she wanted to test Pavlovian learning. Ivan Pavlov with the dog salivating, and the ringing of the bell. And so she did this one experiment with pea seedlings, and she exposed them to wind and light, and she tried to see if they would be able to discern whether or not the presence of wind, wind would have been the bell in the Pavlovian experiment, and then light would have been the treat or the food for the plant. So she exposed them to wind and then light, and eventually she put them into a dark room, and when they were exposed to wind, over 65% of them grew toward it because there was a perceived understanding that there was going to be light. So she actually did this study. Somebody tried to duplicate it and they weren't able to yet, but this was the first study that had ever tried that. And she says she owes that to these conversations that she's having with plants. Now, I have never tripped with a plant or talked with a plant or had any kind of interaction with a plant in that way. I don't know if I ever will. I don't know if she's totally batshit and maybe she's just brilliant. And these are the things that, come out of her, these experiments. But regardless of what anybody thinks of her perspective, on whether plants can talk, it's pretty undeniable that she's reaped some interesting results. Then another one that blew my mind was the Mimosa pudica, which is a sensitive plant. There are these plants that close up their leaves anytime they feel threatened. She exposed a series of Mimosa pudica plants to controlled drops, and she would test whether or not they could remember whether or not they were being dropped. And it turns out they could. They even remembered that the controlled drops weren't a threat. They stopped closing up their leaves after 28 days. So they were able to develop long-term memory and remember those kinds of things. So plants can remember, right? And they can make choices, and they can learn, which is just completely mind-boggling to me. I mean, I'll be honest, I was kind of a Charles de Bouvel person. I thought that plants were just, they were alive, but they weren't making choices. So yeah, anyway, that's just a little intro to some mind-blowing studies, and just Monica G.
Well, it's an interesting concept because I've always had a love of gardening, and I suppose the term we use over here is that if someone's good around the garden or with plants, they're known as being green-fingered. And it was something I sort of inherited from my grandfather, who had a wonderful appreciation of flowers and gardening, and it's something I've kind of learnt, and obviously he's been passed over 20 years now, so it's something that works for me on both a therapeutic level, because I find it quite relaxing and satisfying, but I also find it quite emotive, Krissy, because it reminds me of my grandfather. So in that regard, I'm not surprised when people claim these things, because a lot of people will often refer to them having conversations with plants, because one of the tips that you are often mentioned in regards to becoming a better gardener is that you talk to your plants and they will respond, and if you shout at them they will shrink away, and if you encourage them they will grow. So when I'm reading about these concepts being discussed at a higher level of scientific theory, they don't surprise me as much as I suppose some people may find it, because they may be old wives' tales or the like, but there is a grounding in that a lot of people who enjoy gardening will often have very quirky ways of working with their plants, and they will talk to them and say, oh, it's time for a nice drink of water and things like that. So for someone to then look at that in the scientific lens and utilise that kind of belief doesn't surprise me, if I'm honest. It's one of those things that I would seem it would be worthy of study, because a lot of people will say it does work in their personal experience. Now, maybe that's just convincing themselves that what they're doing is having a positive effect, but I think it's worthy of investigation and study, because we don't know, and I think if you don't know something, you can't just poo-poo it and go, oh, well, that's rubbish, because I think we've learnt over the course of the last 100 years, there are things 100 years ago that would seem like magic in those days, whereas today we take them for granted.
Yeah. Well, so that's what I think is so incredible about this movement that's happening among some botanists right now. There's this guy, Stefano Mancuso, and he founded a lab in Italy, in Florence, called the International Lab of Plant Neurobiology. And so this name is super controversial because plants don't have neurons, they don't have nerves, they don't have a brain. So, and Mancuso understands this as well. So he really pissed off a ton of scientists because they were like, you are suggesting to the general public that plants have brains, and plants do not have brains. Animals and humans have brains. And what he was trying to do, it seems, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but this is my opinion. It seems like he was trying to insert a different perspective in a controversial way. And I think maybe the only way to really get people thinking about plants differently and considering them as intelligent, conscious beings was to sort of light a fire under all of these, scientists' butts.
Yeah.
And so, the interesting thing is that plants do have neuron-like processes, and it's not the same, but their bodies transfer information to and fro, and they, make choices. Now, a plant is different from you or I in that if we get stabbed in the liver or the heart, like, we're fucked, right?
Yeah.
But if that's it, end of the road. But, or if we get our arm chopped off, that's not going to grow back. Whereas plants, they don't have like the organs the way that we do. So you can chop off multiple branches on a tree and it will just continue to live and be fine. But the reason for that is because plants can send, let's say one tree branch gets cut off and like it continues to get cut off. Like, let's say you just keep cutting off one tree branch and it tries to grow back. After 1 or 2 times, the tree will learn and make the decision to not grow a tree branch that way. But that decision, it didn't have to go all the way up to the tree's crown, like to be processed the way humans have to process information. Like everything that happens in the body has to run through our brain first before it goes through the rest of us. The tree, like tree roots, could just send some information up to that one branch and be like, hey, maybe don't grow that way anymore. And the rest of the tree won't have any say in the matter. That's just like the way it works. There's an intelligence there. And it doesn't look anything like the way we think. And, who knows, even using the term think for plants is controversial. But they are making choices. They know how to survive. And they're doing it in a way that's totally alien to us. Speaking of aliens, I think that plants are essentially aliens on Earth. I mean, think about how slowly they move compared to us, and how, if you think about, okay, so if plants are conscious and are aware and they can perceive what's happening around them, how fast are we moving past them? Or do they just see us as like a total blur? And I mean, when we look at them, we're just like, oh, they're not even moving. They're just slow and like stupid or whatever it is. But since writing this piece, I've looked at plants as if they're in another dimension. Like their whole entire existence is so different from what I know that I couldn't possibly even grasp. Who knows? Maybe they, how like an ant can't perceive an elephant? It may just be like that for plants.
I know there are people. A prime example of this, Krissy, is the Venus flytrap, which only grows in South Carolina, as far as I'm aware. And there are people that are convinced that the Venus flytrap is not a native species to Earth, that it must have come from space, attached to a comet or something. Because whilst carnivorous plants are known around the world, I believe the Venus flytrap only grows in certain areas of South Carolina. So there is a train of thought that because it is such an unusual plant, which it is, because essentially it's like a mouse, isn't it, that eats flies.
Right.
That it is so alien to what we expect a plant to be like that people do believe that it could be an alien. I mean, it's not the first thing. I mean, there are certain scientists that believe octopus are alien creatures that have landed on Earth from somewhere. So
sure.
It's not as far out a concept as perhaps people may consider, because when you look at plants, there is a level of reaction to certain things, because I've often wondered, why are certain plants toxic? Because surely no plant wants to be eaten, you would imagine, if it has a conscious level.
Right.
But how does a plant decide to be toxic? How does it make that decision? Do we work on the principle that all plants were toxic and then some weren't? Or did some plants develop it? There has to be some kind of evolution, and once again, that shows a level of intelligence that we perhaps shouldn't ascribe to plants. However, surely all plants would be toxic under those circumstances. What makes some plants toxic and others not? It's once you open up this Pandora's box of perception in regards to the world of plants. It can just take you down so many rabbit holes that I think you don't know, you realise how little most people understand and know about plants.
So yeah, to your point, that like plants we know now that plants will work together even if they are different species. They'll work together to fight against herbivores. So like plants who are strangers to each other, not the same species, they will be able to pick up on like volatile like compounds and chemicals released saying, hey, there are these bunnies that are biting us, like just FYI, you better start putting up your chemical defenses to taste bad, right? So like for a long time, plants were thought to be kind of always just competitors of each other, even if they're the same species. But we actually know now that plants will work together, even if they're of a separate species, if they have a common enemy. And they can recognize whether a plant is in their family or not. They even put a bunch of different kinds of species of plants in one plot, and they noticed that they were fighting for survival. They were like growing over each other or whatever. And then they did another plot with all species of the exact same species, and they gave each other space. Yeah. They were like, to proliferate, we have to, make room. So, and Monica did another study where she completely deprived certain plants. It was, what was it? It was I think it was the tomato plants. So she put a tomato plant in a completely sealed like container, so it couldn't use any of its senses to judge what was around it. And she put fennel next to it in, completely deprived of all senses. And fennel is a plant that usually attacks and will take over a whole area.
Yep.
And then she also put basil next to it. And basil is like a friend to the tomato plant. So the basil will like help nourish the soil and all of that stuff. And even though it was like, couldn't see what plants were around it or whatever, when the fennel was close by, the tomato plant started growing more, like started to try to proliferate and like grow more, like as if, competition. And it also recognized the basil, where it actually grew better. So how is it that they can perceive without even being able to send chemical compounds? Like how can they perceive and know what's near? That is just, there's no answer for that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, strangely enough, I know we'd arranged this a couple of weeks ago, and the other day I was reading one of my emails that I get, and I think it came from the Australian Geographic, Krissy, and it was about the symbiotic relationship between marigolds and cabbages. And
yeah.
Essentially, if you want a really good cabbage crop, you grow marigolds in between them. Because the marigold repels insects that eat cabbages. And once again, you have a symbiotic relationship of two very different plants, because one's for food, one's for decoration.
Right.
And it's one of those things, and you think, well, how on earth did somebody work that out? So were cabbages just growing better near marigolds? And somebody went, well, I wonder if that's the reason. And I just found, and obviously because I knew what we were going to talk about, and you'd very kindly sent me your fabulous piece of work.
Thank you.
I just thought it was mind-blowing once again that you have two very distinctly different plants who have worked out a relationship that for cabbages to grow better than they normally would on their own in a field under normal farming circumstances, Krissy. If you want to bump a crop of cabbage, you plant it full of marigolds as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's just so cool to think about how, these plants can just sort of like decide to be each other's friends, even though maybe in another scenario they would like, hate each other or whatever it is, you don't, and again, I use these terms like friends and hate and like all of these things that are ascribed to humans, right? And one of the most difficult aspects of writing this piece was like, we don't really have the language to talk about what these plants are doing. So we have to use these terms, these like anthropomorphic terms. And one of the things that really chaps some scientists like asses is that, okay, well, we're saying that plants can talk, and like, oh, since they can feel vibrations and that affects how they grow, we have to say that they can hear. So the general public will understand what they're doing, but they're not really hearing. So we're in this sort of a pickle, and I mean, I just think that probably comes down to, how the world just needs to be more educated in terms of the scientific method and how to look at scientific subjects. But to be honest, I don't really think that it's so bad that we're using these anthropomorphic terms because it gets people interested. And okay, so you know the whole thing where plants like hate heavy metal?
Yes.
There's a while ago, there was this lady who was just going to college. She was getting a music degree, and she published this book, and it said, oh, I played classical music to my plants, and they grew better, and then I played rock music to them, and they all suffered. Okay, this is just like, wasn't a very good experiment, but it kind of took off, and a lot of people believed that it was, plants could listen to music. She did this whole experiment, and later on, Mythbusters did an experiment where they found that plants actually prefer heavy metal. Yeah. Like really heavy metal. And they grew better in the heavy metal environment. So like these kinds of things about plants and their preferences and everything, it may not be scientifically accurate, but somebody who is willing to play music for their plants and to talk to their plants and all of that probably will end up taking better care of the earth. That's just my perspective. So like, even if the general public doesn't have like a super scientific perspective on plants, if they start to consider plants as living beings that should be, respected and, considered thoughtfully, then maybe our planet would be in better shape.
I think so. I think it shows a level of respect that they probably give more time to their plant hobby or whatever, Krissy, that they do have a better realisation of their impact on the planet, I think, and that's probably where that kind of behaviour would fit in more. And it is interesting because this concept of playing music to plants is something that keeps coming round. I know you mention it in your article, but I remember this when it came out, where there was an Italian vineyard owner who claimed that Mozart made his plants grow better. And if you looked at that, you go, oh, well, Mozart makes his plants grow better. And essentially, when you dig into it, it's because he was playing music and it scared everything away. So the birds weren't coming and pecking the grapes and things, which, when you look at it on that level, you think, well, obviously, if you're going to be playing Mozart, it doesn't matter what you're playing. Birds aren't going to sit there listening to piano concertos blasting at them, or, and insects, because these things work on frequencies as well. And I think, like that Mythbusters thing, I think it kind of showed that the frequency is the most important thing, not the actual style of music. But there was a British programme that was quite similar to Mythbusters over here that was called Brainiac, and they did a similar experiment, which was about the old wives' tale that if you microwaved water and fed hot water to plants, they would grow better. So they did an experiment where they used sort of rainwater, tap water, irradiated water, and then just normal tepid water. And essentially the microwave water did see the plants grow better. But they were working on the principle of, well, it's probably because it's got rid of all the impurities out of the water and zapped everything, so it's probably super clean. And therefore, it's probably more nutritious because it's just giving it what it needs. So I think when you start to look at different things, there are obviously little nuances to experiments that on face value you go, oh, brilliant, grapevines love Mozart, when in essence it's just the noise that protects them.
Right. Well, and they've discovered that plants will actually they can discern the difference in certain sounds. So like plants like flowers can actually detect bee wings, the sound of bee wings, and they will start to produce a sweeter nectar to attract the bees to them. And there's even an indication that the flowers, like the actual flower of the plant in its like with its bowl shape, might actually act as a kind of as an ear, quote unquote, that will be able to pull in the sounds. So I think like it really would just depend on it would depend on the sound. Like maybe if you were, constantly blasting, a song that hit the same frequency as bee wings, you would see a different reaction, in whatever plant, you were playing it for. So these are the kinds of things that like can really change how we farm, and like, it can completely change agriculture, because it's like if we can tune in, no pun intended, like, and figure out what sounds will benefit certain plants and like their growth and their health, like this could, improve, like maybe we won't have to use so many fertilizers, like, or like pesticides and things like that. Maybe it would change the way, like, the toxic chemicals being pumped into the ground constantly. Like, these are the things that really get like botanists like juiced up. Like that's because I mean, everybody's so scared that we're all going to die because we're destroying the planet. So this is like, I don't know, this is the kind of stuff that's really cool. And I just want to say, because we were talking about aliens earlier, and I forgot to mention this, but I want to mention it now. I was reading about something, and it's called a bleeding tooth fungus plant. Have you heard of this plant?
No, I've not.
It's a mushroom, and it kind of looks like gums, like teeth gums, and it just oozes purple-ish red goo.
Yeah.
It looks like bleeding gums.
Yeah.
It is disgusting. And when I look at this, I'm just like, this is the stuff of horrors. Like, this is like an alien creature. And when you brought up the Venus flytrap, there's this other plant. It's called a bladderwort. Also very disgusting. But it lives in fresh water, and it kind of functions like the flytrap, where it'll like grab like whatever it can and eat it, because it's a carnivore. And so we're talking about consciousness, intelligence, the ability to choose, like all of this stuff, and how scientists were completely like, oh, there's no way that plants could be intelligent. There's no way that they could be conscious, whatever. But they also were afraid to call plants carnivores. Because, you've got the whole Little Shop of Horrors, like, Feed Me Seymour thing, which is just terrifying, right? So it's like, if you think about, it's like the idea of plants being intelligent, the idea of plants being conscious, being alien, and being able to, like, make choices to maybe eat us. I think that's one of the reasons why there was sort of I don't want to call it a halt in scientific study of plants and like what they can do, but like maybe there was a deterrent to explore the unknown more, because what makes those plants so spooky is that they don't have brains and we can't read their minds. So we kind of have to come up with these stories in our heads of like how they're communicating and what they actually want. And because we're so human centric, we just automatically assume like, oh, they want to kill us. they want to take over and kill us because that's what we do to them. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Anyway, but I remembered that. I just really wanted to tell you about this bleeding gum plant because it was gross.
Yeah, well, there is a very famous fungus which is known as dead man's fingers. Have you ever seen that?
No.
And that essentially, it's I'm not sure if it's a member of the mushroom family, but essentially it grows on decaying wood or dead tree stumps, and it honestly looks like a corpse's fingers popping out. And I'm not sure if you cut it, it oozes like a reddy, purpley substance. But they terrify people all over the world come across these growing. I'll send you a link to it. But they really do. It's one of those weird, wonderful things in nature, Krissy, that you just think, why? You know, it's just crazy. And there's certain aspects of man-eating plants that I think always terrifies people. I know in the world of the weird and wonderful, one of the stories I remember reading as a kid, and it's one of those tales that was printed, I think, at the end of the 19th century. There was a couple of things. There was a Madagascan tree. It was called the Madagascan tree that was supposed to be a man-eating tree. Obviously in Madagascar. But there was also another one called the Yatevo, which was supposed to resemble a snake, and they called it the Yatevo because of the sound it made. It kind of went Yatevo when it was trying to fling its vines about to impale these spikes into people and animals and drag them. And there used to be all these, explorers that had been off to South America and Africa, Krissy, claiming to have had an encounter with these giant man-eating plants. So it's clearly something that's been with us for a very long time, I think.
Well, we also think about it, humans haven't been around that long, and I mean, before we even existed, back in dino times or whatever, who knows what was what was happening back then? Who knows what kind of plants were around? I mean, I think the general consensus is that back during dino times, everything was kind of green and brown. Yeah. Plants were not really that colorful, and they didn't start getting colorful till much later on because they realized they needed to grow petals and attract pollinators and stuff. But I know that the plants started to generate color because they realized that made them more attractive to the insects that they needed to attract. I mean, it's kind of like the corpse flower, right? Yeah. Where it learned to start, smelling like rotting flesh to attract dung beetles and flies and stuff. I mean, I guess, it's sort of like humans, right? People like to smell good, and put perfume on, just dab a little corpse behind your ear. It works.
It is remarkable as well, because there just seems to be so many variations, because, like you say, it's one of those things, why are so few plants blue? Or have blue flowers, because blue flowers tend to be a more modern creation through cross-pollination and the changing of things, because blue plants that had blue flowers, for example, as far as I was aware, didn't get pollinated as successfully because they weren't as attractive. So that's why most plants had yellow and red and white and orange flowers, because they seem to be the most attractive to pollinators, Krissy. So once again, you have that decision, because how does a plant decide what colour flower it's going to be? I mean, these are all, we just take things for granted, and yet there has to be some kind of, I wouldn't naturally say decision, but it's one of those things. It is like evolution. It's survival of the fittest. So did these plants grow a variety of colours, and it was only the ones that were yellow and white and red and orange that survived, and the ones that had green and blue flowers died away? It once again, you open up a whole avenue of possibility that takes you into a disturbing thought process, I think. Well,
so you're talking about just you bringing up, how plants, could know to change their color. I was just reading a piece about how, plants probably on other planets won't be blue, right? They'll have a bunch of different colors. But what really stood out to me in this article was that the perspective of the journalist was why are scientists even bothering to think about the color of, vegetative life on other planets? It's just it was sort of why should we even care about plants on other planets? And their studies were framed around, well, if we can pick up on vegetative life on another planet, then that would indicate there is intelligent life there as well, or there could be. And it's just that, think about that differentiation there, where it's vegetation means somebody else there could be intelligent. But they're not framing it as, this is another planet intelligent life could look completely different. And so what we perceive, we just think of plants as these stupid just resources to get rid of. And if we saw alien life, or we saw an alien plant on our planet, like, would we even be able to tell the difference or understand that what we're interacting with is as intelligent or even more intelligent than we are?
Yeah. Well, I think that always comes down to the arrogantly assuming that life will look like us. And I've often been baffled by this presumption by people, Krissy, because it's using a very narrow scope of understanding, which is essentially what we base everything on Earth, that we utilise our understanding of how our planet works and how we exist, and look at everything else in the universe and think, oh, well, it must be based like this. This must be how things happen. Everything has to be a carbon-based life form. You cannot tell me that something at the far end of the galaxy could be anything. Like I say, we could be talking about planets that are inhabited by intelligent plants on a conscious level. You can't just say, oh, well, because that doesn't happen on Earth, it can't happen anywhere else in the universe. That's rubbish, surely. It's nonsense.
Right. Well, that sort of gets into the other. So, like, intelligence is a big, touchy thing, right? But consciousness, plant consciousness, is even touchier.
Yes.
Because people say, are plants conscious? And, you're just kind of like, well, how do you define consciousness? Because there have been tens of thousands of philosophical papers published on what consciousness is. And you can, look it up in the dictionary, and there's, a few definitions for it. But basically, the general idea is that, consciousness is awareness. On its most basic level, if you go to sleep, you're unconscious. If you wake up, you're conscious. And so with plants, there are these scientists that say, they published a paper, they said plants neither possess nor require consciousness, period. They're just there's no way that plants are conscious. They said they don't have a brain, and the brain is what dictates whether or not you're conscious. And the whole perspective on this came from the idea that, how earlier we were talking about how all the signals in the human body have to go through the brain to then have, the body function. So the idea of what consciousness is that in the human brain, it's derived from a bunch of pictures and emotions and personality traits and everything that are dictated by the brain. So the brain takes all these information from your senses and makes this map, essentially, of your life. And with this map, you can make guesses about what could happen in the future. You can remember the past. You don't just respond to the stimuli around you. You're deciding what can happen before you're even stimulated by anything. So, if you see somebody walking towards you and their fist is raised, you can probably guess they're going to punch you in the face. That's what our consciousness allows us to discern. But a plant, from these scientists' perspectives, the plant cannot, that is going to get punched. It's just going to get punched. A branch is going to break off, and then it's going to be oh, I have this lower form of memory that will say, oh, when your branch gets, cut off, you grow in a different direction. Plants just kind of respond to what happens to them. They have sort of a reactionary existence, whereas humans and animals can plan, and they also have trauma and things like that. There's no real evidence, since plants don't have a prefrontal cortex, which dictates emotion, personality, and stuff. There's no evidence that they actually can plan. They can remember, but they can't actually do that higher level thinking.
Yeah. I mean, it is intriguing because obviously you have people like the theoretical physicist Michio Kaku, who prescribes consciousness on essentially everything. And he prescribes the theory of, well, why shouldn't plants have consciousness? Which then again goes against everything that scientists and philosophers have theorized over generations, Krissy. But once again, this seems to fall into that scientific assumption, because we know still next to nothing about how a brain works. Because if we did, we could fire up the bits that allow certain people to be talented. We should all be talented. Why can't we all be virtuoso musicians or talented writers or painters or athletes? Because it's all about how the brain functions and fires. And if we had any concept of how it worked, it would immeasurably improve medical science overnight, because we would be able to deal with people who had suffered traumatic brain injury or have misfires in their brain that don't allow their body to function in the ways that it should, or we presume it should. And yet we have to accept that when we are told what consciousness is, we have to base it basically on a tiny piece of knowledge that is constantly developing, and yet it is prescribed as that is just how it is.
Yeah. Well, because there's also, like, if you think about, like, the Gaia hypothesis and things that are similar to that, there's this whole idea that the universe is actually the conscious being, you know, and we're all just, it's like we're cells in the body of the planet or the universe, and we're all working together. And so, like, consciousness isn't just limited to inside us, it's everywhere. And one of the reasons that humans suffer so much, right, this is like more of a philosophical idea, but you know, almost Buddhist, one of the reasons that humans suffer is because we forget that we're connected, and we lie to ourselves and say that we're not connected to the whole planet, and then that leads to its, you know, inevitable destruction, right? So Michio, like who you were talking about, the physicist, he thinks that plants actually possess consciousness on a spectrum. So they may have a couple units of consciousness, whereas humans have, whatever he said, 10 or whatever it was, maybe more than that. Yeah. But I was thinking this to myself the other day, and this is just about humans only, but it kind of feeds into this idea that we're all a part of the same thing. You know how some people are really into, I don't know, skiing? People love skiing. I don't want to ski. No. I have absolutely no. I would much rather sit around on my ass and type on my computer than hit the slopes. Yep. Because of that, I'm serving a completely different function in the world. I'm like, yes, there are a lot of similarities, like physically, between me and this person who hits the slopes, but we're different and we serve different purposes, whatever. And so there's like this assumption, and there's tendency to generalize the purpose of humans are just because we have like similar parts or whatever on the planet. And I was just thinking about our bodies, right? And how there are a lot of cells that are similar to each other, but just slightly different, and they serve a completely different purpose within the body. I was just thinking, like, maybe there are some people like Monica who can talk to plants, and she will be able to talk to plants forever, and she'll love hitting the slopes. Like, let's just say she loves doing that stuff, hitting the slopes, talking to plants. I'm over here sitting on my ass writing, not talking to plants, but just interviewing her or whatever. Just like the idea that we know what consciousness is, what our purpose is, why we're all here, looking at each other saying, oh, we're similar to each other, we're not similar to plants. Oh, plants have some neuron-like abilities, but since they don't have a brain, you know, whatever. I know this is a roundabout way of saying that it's just everything we do every day is based on this assumption, and I have no idea where this assumption really came from. I have a question for you. Like, do you feel like when you're awake, do you feel like you're conscious, and when you dream, do you feel like you're unconscious? Or like when you're having dreams, do you feel like, you know, you're actively experiencing life? I know it's kind of a big question, but... Now,
it is interesting because, strangely enough, I stopped smoking in June. And I haven't really dreamt a lot until I'd stopped smoking. And since I've stopped smoking, I've started to dream a lot more. Now, it may be that I always dreamt, Krissy, and for whatever reason, nicotine or tobacco or something was blocking my ability to remember. There would only be very, very occasional moments when I could tell you what I'd been dreaming about. Since June, I can clearly remember 30 or 40 dreams I've had. which is probably more than I could probably tell you of the previous 20 years. Now, I can't tell you what the reason for that is. I'm prescribing a train of thought that perhaps stopping smoking has enabled my brain to shake off this shackle that perhaps it had through nicotine dependence, and my brain is working in a different way. I don't know. But I found that very peculiar, because I'm one of those... When people used to talk about dreaming and things like that, I'd be like, why don't I dream? Because I used to dream a lot as a kid. I still remember a couple of really weird dreams I had as a child, which is peculiar in itself. Mm-hmm. But to be honest, I've had more dreams and more unsettling dreams since June, since the summer, than I've had in my entire life, I would prescribe. And it's peculiar. At first, I didn't like it. Mm-hmm. Now I've kind of got used to it. And I'm not really sure if that's just my brain working things out for me now I'm free of this addiction, or I'm finally able to utilise it properly.
Yeah, well, so that's really interesting, because there's this whole perspective that plants can't sleep. Like, yes. They're just, like, awake all of the time.
Yep.
And we've just assumed, because I was just talking about all these assumptions, like, all plants can't sleep was like the perspective, right? Plants look like this, humans look like this, humans sleep, plants don't. Like, all these assumptions we have, right?
Yeah.
And consciousness ends when you go to sleep. You're unconscious, even though your mind's doing all of this stuff or whatever, like all of these assumptions. But this recent study of trees, and they monitored trees overnight, and they found that they actually sag a little bit. And it looks like they might actually be resting, and they might have their own kind of circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
And basically, the theory is that it's possible that there's this internal water pressure that becomes like really lax when no photosynthesis is occurring during the daylight.
Yep.
And so this relaxation could be a tree's form of sleep. It just looks different than ours. If a tree were to go to sleep or sag, is the tree then unconscious?
Yeah.
If we're making these statements about like what consciousness is or whatever, then it could very easily bleed into the whole tree thing, and we could be saying that they could sleep and be awake. And then if a tree is sleeping and waking, what then are they also doing that's just like us? And is that going to affect how we treat them in the future?
Yeah. I mean, like I say, as someone that gardens and has plants outside, it's noticeable that some of the plants that I cultivate and look after, when it's dark or when it gets cloudy, they close up. So they're not expending energy. But it's still daylight. At some level, it's still light, And yet, when it goes cloudy or if it gets dark, they will then shut up. And there are numerous examples of certain plants that seem to curl up at night, or sort of wrap themselves up, as if, in our definition of it, Krissy, they are preparing themselves for bed, or they're snuggling up. You know what I mean? Right. And so I found that section very interesting, because I think that was done in the was it birch trees they were looking at in regards to the drooping?
Yes, I believe it was.
Because I found that section really interesting, because obviously there's this fascinating gentleman that you brought to my attention who I'd never heard of, who is Peter Waldenbein, who believes that trees essentially have personalities, and the older ones teach the new ones how to be. And he runs a forestry area, and essentially he runs it in a very different way to normal people, because a lot of people tend to get rid of older trees, whereas he works on the principle that the older trees educate the others, which I found a fascinating concept, that he basically works on this principle of prescribing knowledge to an aged tree, which I found incredible as a concept. And the fact that he puts that into practice and seems to be reaping the rewards from it.
Yes, this Peter dude is pretty wild. So he takes care of, his like own little forest. First, I should say the Wood Wide Web. This is what scientists are calling it. Like, it's basically the network of trees. They use fungus in the ground to transfer nutrients back and forth.
Yeah.
And so, like, younger trees will actually be fed nutrients through this Wood Wide Web through the older trees. And the older trees, because their roots are so spread out and they have so many connections, they're actually responsible for regulating important and, helpful chemicals and nutrients and stuff throughout the community. And so they discovered that when you cut down older trees, like when you're really just trying to pump out some trees for some paper or whatever. If you keep like cutting down old trees and planting new trees, the young trees actually are unhealthier as they grow, because they don't have these older trees maintaining the system and keeping them healthy. It's like mother trees, essentially. If a mother tree senses that, a young tree isn't getting enough sunlight or nutrients, it will actually take some from other trees and give some away that it has, because it knows that that tree needs it to live. And so people are like, oh, well, are trees doing this on purpose? Are they altruistic? And scientists say, well, you can't actually ask a tree whether or not it was doing that out of the good of its heart, right? It could just be trying to help species survive. But there's this one example that just totally freaked me out. So there was this stump that was about 4 centuries old, and Peter talks about how it was a beech tree and it was cut, and he cut it open and saw that there was still green chlorophyll under the thick bark. And so it didn't have any leaves. It couldn't make any sugar, couldn't do its photosynthesis thing. And so the only real explanation as to how the stump could be living for this long is because the trees around it decided to keep it alive. And it's like, why would you do that? Trees, it's like, it just doesn't make any sense, and there's no real explanation. But he asserts that trees are altruistic and that, they deserve respect, and we should completely change the way that we treat our forests, because they are constantly working together to help each other.
Yeah, I think that section's really fascinating, because there seems to be several studies that show that trees seem to work on a different principle, because I think there's another study in regards to the Douglas fir tree that a lady undertook, and that was showing what you could almost say was a symbiotic relationship where they would help each other. And once again, as you say, we're prescribing human definitions to plants' behaviour and the behaviour of trees, Krissy. And I don't think the language really kind of gives it credence, because it maybe prescribes things to it that aren't there, as we were saying about being altruistic. But why would trees keep a fallen tree alive? Why would trees share nutrients? Why would they support younger ones? Because that seems to be moving growth and the life of plants and trees to a different level entirely, because you would simply work on the principle, well, if you just plant a load of trees, they'll just grow. But some trees will actually change their branches, so it allows more sunlight into their neighbours and things like that. And so these seem to be some kind of reaction on a level that surely can't possibly be real, if we are to believe mainstream science.
Well, yeah, and the other thing in terms of altruism and ascribing, these ideas to humans, is that Peter noticed that when trees will sometimes pair up as friends, kind of the way a human couple will pair up. So if they're next to each other, they just make it a point to share nutrients with each other and keep the other one alive. And then if you chop one down, the other one will die soon after. The way human couples, if one of them dies, when they're old, another one will die too. So it is a very limiting language that we have for these sorts of things. But Peter is kind of in the same boat that I am, where it's just if we constantly talk to the public in super scientific speak, or we don't commit to the idea that these trees are living beings worthy of respect, then maybe we'll all just continue to treat them as if they're automatons.
Yeah, I have to say, Krissy, it's probably the most challenging yet thoroughly enlightening thing I've read this year, this article.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Because as I said to you in the preamble before we started what's supposed to be the professional discussion, but it's us two. So but I love to be pushed into areas that I'm not aware of, or I may have a basic understanding of certain things. And like I say, I'm not saying I understand more about gardening because I enjoy it and I do it. But out of my peer group, none of my friends do it. None of them have that kind of relationship with or find pleasure in gardening that I do. I find I find it quite relaxing. I find it quite therapeutic, as much as I do watching a good TV show or reading a damn good book or listening to a great song. You know, I'm not going to say gardening's as good as a great night out with friends or a brilliant meal, but it's certainly something I take pleasure in, and it makes me feel good. So to read and comprehend the level of study and scientific analysis that's going on in these fields is both challenging and thoroughly enlightening, because it just opens up a whole realm of possibilities that I think, when we have situations like this, I never understand where the lines are drawn in science where it says we shall not go past this, because I've always worked on the principle that science's very nature is to push past these lines and push past these boundaries, because if we don't, then we will simply stop evolving, both physically and mentally. And I can't comprehend that certain people, and it happens across all realms of scientific understanding, and as someone that's worked a lot in regards to writing about other scientific topics, as you have done, Krissy, do you find it as frustrating that there seems to be this kind of arrogant presumption that plants simply exist?
Yeah, it's very frustrating to me when I'm sitting down and I'm reading about all of these really fascinating capabilities that plants have, that we know, like, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that, you know, plants can have their own version of hearing, you know, like things like that. And they can make decisions. We know that for sure. Like, they choose to do something, you know, like to escape from shade, like, where do I grow? How do I grow around a rock? All these things. They have these complex systems. And so, as I'm not a scientist, I just really enjoy science and scientists. But as somebody who doesn't have a stake in the game, like, I don't have to get my scientific study published, you know, nobody is ever going to be like, you're nuts, get out of here, or whatever, and, you know, you'll never make it in botany or whatever. It's just not like, it's not something that I have to deal with. So I kind of have the luxury of being able to sit here and opine and consider wildly, without any professional kickback. But I also get why some scientists are upset about, you know, the use of the term plant neurobiology, because plants really don't have human brains. Like, we do know that. There's a lot we don't know about plants, but that's for sure. And then I think also, because there is so much misinformation out there right now, we do need to be careful about saying that plants have ears, you know, their petals are like ears or whatever, because people can take that and just completely transform it. And then eventually, what if there's a PETA for plants? You know, like we have to eat something, you know, and it's scary. I think the resistance toward the idea of plants being intelligent or conscious it comes from, it's a scary idea to think that when I go outside and I pick a tomato plant, it's screaming. You know, and I just can't hear it. Like, that's like a scary thought, okay? Yeah. And, you know, then I walk into a grocery store, it's like, am I just looking at a bunch of corpses that died these horrible deaths that were ripped from their families or whatever? Like, that's like horrific, right? And then you also know that a lot of them died in vain because they're all going to end up in a dumpster, these kinds of things. But then it's also, on the other side of things, it's scary that we could be hurting them, but it's also scary that they could want to hurt us. So once you open up the idea that plants could be conscious and intelligent and maybe have intent and malicious intent, it makes life on this planet more unnerving, you know? And so there are a bunch of these scientists who are human beings. And I think that if we were to start looking at plants or making assumptions or opening up the conversation about whether plants could feel pain or that they need respect or whatever, that would have to change how we experiment on them. That would have to change our agricultural practices. It would completely fuck with capitalism for sure. So I'm sure there are a lot of people out there who would not be fans of that. I mean, it would completely turn our entire society on its head if we were to start looking at plants this way. That's the fear. But I personally think that that's kind of extreme. I think probably, even if we knew that plants had feeling, we'd probably still murder them anyway. Just like historically, humans are horrible. And I really just don't think that we would be nice to them even if we knew, because we still treat animals like shit.
Well,
But I think that's the prevailing fear, is that plants will end up having a lot more power than they do. And then what are we going to do with that? That means we have less power.
Yeah. Well, I think that is... I'm sure there are people out there concerned about rights to plants and worrying about things that possibly are not going to happen. But some people seem to be able to get angry about anything, whether it's real or imagined, Krissy, these days.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's what else are we doing? It's a pandemic.
Yes. Oh.
We got to get pissed about something. I mean, God, it's like, how else do we get our heart rates up? We're not exercising.
Very true, very true. So, where can everybody find this brilliant article and read more about it? Because I recommend it highly. It really, as I said, was very challenging, but so enlightening, and I learnt so much reading it.
Well, I really appreciate that. It'll be in the December 2020 issue of Edge Science, which should be coming out mid-December. I'm not sure of the exact date, but I will definitely post a link to it on my social media. My name is Krissy Eliot, Krissy Eliot, very Googleable. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, just Krissy Eliot, keeping it simple, KrissyEliot.com. And also, if you want to see me blogging about weird crap, you can go to hotalien.com, which is my blog. Easy to find. Also, when you read it, if you have weird plant experiences, if you've tripped with a tree, I want to hear about it. Send me an email or, a message on social media, the Krissy Eliot, TheKrissy @gmail.com. Really into this stuff. Really want to know what you think, and I hope you enjoy it.
No, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for bringing this subject to our attention. It's been a pleasure to speak to you again. It's been too long. So thank you as always, Krissy, and I wish you continued success with your writing.
Thank you.